Welcome, everyone. Uh, Anyone who's read an annual letter of Berkshire Hathaway has often come away marveling at Warren Buffett's ability to distill complex uh, concepts into very intuitive language. Our speaker for today, Mohnish Pabrai, is someone who paid $650,000 for a lunch with Warren Buffett in 2007. It's a sum he calls a bargain. And in the same spirit as Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, he has a very intuitive, very evocative, very emotionally appealing way of distilling complex concepts into his form of connecting with the audience. He's probably a fantastic teacher, although he does not carry that official title if you go by any of his presentations to various university groups. Our speaker from last time, Michael Mauboussin, spoke about the role of luck and skill in life. He spoke about how there is not often a linear cause and effect chain, but a spectrum of probabilistic outcomes in life. Mohnish takes that one step further. He talks about being preferential towards probabilistic scenarios where you have a limited downside, but a disproportionately high upside. Also, I could go on and on about his investing philosophy, his philanthropic activities, so on and so forth. But I think what we'll see here is how he really cares about connecting with the audience and how good of a teacher he is. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mohnish Pabrai.
Oh. Thank you, Saurabh. It's a wonderful, warm welcome. Very much appreciated. And it was pretty exciting for me when we got the email from Saurabh about the possibility of speaking at Google, because it's easy to be a fan, and I think it's a wonderful company. In fact, I think in many ways, in the end, when we look back, I think Google might very well be the greatest company ever created, and for a variety of reasons. And one of your board members, he's not a friend, he's an acquaintance of mine, and I'd asked him a few years back, so what's the next Google? And his response, he instantly said, the next Google is Google. And I think that's just a great reply, because I think it's the way the company is designed. Warren Buffett always says that investing in businesses with rapid change are the enemy of the investor. In many ways, Google is kind of future-proof from that vantage point, just because of the way it's structured. And so it's quite exciting to be outside the plex and look in and see all the great stuff going on. So anyway, from a number of perspectives, I'm delighted to be here, and always kick myself for never investing in Google stock, but there's still time, and we might still get there one day. So we'll see. So the Dhandho Investor, the book that came out a few years back. Buffett has a quote. He says, "I'm a better investor because I'm a businessman, and I'm a better businessman because I'm an investor." And in essence, that book, The Dhandho Investor, is the expansion of that one sentence into 100+ pages. Basically, kind of delving into that particular nuance. And the word Dhandho is a Gujarati word. And do we have any Gujaratis in the room? Oh, we have one Gujarati. All right, that's good. So people always think I'm from Gujarat in India because I wrote a book called The Dhandho Investor, and I have to always correct them and say I'm not Gujarati. I had a roommate from Gujarat, and he when I was doing my undergraduate in engineering, and he was also an engineering major, He used to disappear on weekends because all his family, extended family, had all these motels and laundromats and gas stations and whatnot that they owned in the Carolinas. And then he'd come back on Sunday night and he'd be bursting with all these stories about the new investments his family had made and all the kind of the economics of those investments. And then in the end, he would finish and say, Mohnish, Dhandho. And that was his way of saying that the literal translation of the word Dhandho means business. But the way the Gujaratis use it, what it means is it's a way of doing business where you basically have upside with almost a non-existent downside. And which is the key to investing is, like Buffett says, rule number 1, don't lose money, and rule number 2, don't forget rule number 1. And so that was kind of the backdrop behind the title and the book. And the Indians make up about 1% of the population of the United States, a little over 3 million people. And the Patels, who are from Gujarat, are a much smaller portion of that 3 million. My guess is they'll probably be less than 1/5 of 1% of the US population, well under 500,000 or so. And even though they're that small a portion, probably more than 60% of the motels in this country are under Patel ownership. And that's a stunning statistic, considering that 40 years back there were no Patels over here. So they went from basically a standing start to pretty much dominating this industry, and they've moved up market. So they used to be at the lowest end, the smallest 10, 20, 30 room type highway motels, and now they're buying the Marriotts and the Westons and the Hiltons and all of that. So they're kind of moving up the chain, and they came to the United States as refugees, and most of them came from East Africa, from Uganda. And at that time, in the early 70s, there was this dictator, Idi Amin, who came into power in Uganda. And the Patels actually had come to Uganda several decades, more than 100 years before that. And they came mostly as indentured laborers. But over time, using their Dhandho techniques, they pretty much controlled large portions of the Ugandan economy. And Idi Amin was very pissed off about that. And his perspective was that Africa is for Africans. And so what he did is he pretty much nationalized all their assets and took over all their personal property and threw them out of the country. And so they were stateless, actually. They really had no state to go to. India was reeling from the Bangladesh war and all the refugees coming from Bangladesh. So India actually refused to take the Patels in as refugees. England took some. In the United States, at that time, the Nixon administration, they were quite familiar with the issue, and they were sympathetic to the plight of the Patels, but they were limited. So they took in, the United States took in a few thousand Patels, a few more thousand came to Canada. And most of these Patels who showed up in the US in the early 70s didn't have that much in the way of education. And the only money they could really carry with themselves was kind of whatever they could convert into gold quickly, a few $1,000s. And so they landed up in the United States, and they really found that they had virtually no skills which were of use to most employers. They had a heavy accent and really didn't have much in terms of skills. And but they found that motels, buying motels was a great way to go. And the reason they thought that was that because a typical Patel family at the time could buy a 10 or 15 room motel for well under $100,000, maybe $50,000 to $75,000. And the family could live in one or two of those rooms. And because motels are labor intensive, they would pretty much fire all the staff, and the family would do all the work. So laundry, cleaning rooms, watching the front desk, everything was done by different members of the family. And they became low-cost operators. They looked at every single facet of the business. And so once a motel came under Patel ownership, two things happened. One is that their operating costs dropped. And because their operating costs were lower, they were able to charge lower rates and increase occupancy. And so typically the Patel-owned motel in a particular area would always do economically better in terms of cash flows than the other non-Patel-owned motels. And as soon as they had enough cash flow, they would buy the second motel and then the third motel, and they just keep levering them and buying them up. And we end up with the result where we are today, where they pretty much dominate the space. And that aspect to the way they went about doing their business has a lot of correlation with investing, because the whole Buffett sentence of being a good businessman is a great skill set to being a great investor. And the particular facet that they followed was this notion that I call heads I win and tails I don't lose much. So if you looked at the economics of a Patel buying a motel, typically, they would put $5,000 or $10,000 down, and most of it was a bank loan. And if for some reason they were not able to manage the cash flows, the banks really would prefer not to take the motel back for closing it. They would prefer to do, what they did recently in the financial crisis, extend and pretend. Keep the same guy running it, and hope that things kind of improve. So either way, the end result was the Patels, even with high leverage, were unlikely to lose their properties, and they didn't. Because they were smart operators, they got nowhere near that mark. And after a few years, banks actually wanted to lend to motels under Patel ownership, because they saw the default rates and all that were markedly different than the rest of the population. And so that worked out quite well for them. And there's this notion that it's just the Patels that have this kind of tight-fisted way of operating, and this heads I win, tails I don't lose much. But it's actually all is available to us anywhere we look, and you find it in all kinds of places. So, for example, if you look at Richard Branson in England, who's as far away from the Patels as you can think of, and if you examine the way Branson runs his different businesses, they're very much in sync with the Patel model of operating, with heads I win, tails I don't lose much. So, for example, before the formation of Virgin Atlantic Airlines, Branson used to be in the music business. He was a publisher of music, and these different like Boy George and the Sex Pistols and so on were now some of the brands that he had brought up. And so one day he goes to his partners and says that he wants to start an airline, and he wants to basically fly between London and New York, and that he thinks it's a great market to go into. So his partners were quite floored. They said, "Look, we're doing very well in the music business. We know nothing about the airline business. You need a jumbo jet to get into the airline business, and that jumbo jet costs about $200 million. We don't have $200 million. And we don't know anything about the business." So he says, "Well, someone sent me this business plan." And Branson was smart. He said that, if an executive in the music business gets a business plan to start an airline flying between London and New York, that this business plan has gone to 300 other places before that and got turned down at every place that knew anything about the business. But he was intrigued by the plan, and he tried calling British Airways over the weekend to try to book some flights just to see what the customer service was like, and he couldn't get through. So he said, well, either there's so much business that there's enough there for a second player to come in, or they're so bad that a second player can come in and do a better job. Either way, there's room for that. And then his partners told him that, yeah, that's all fine, Richard, but we don't have the money, we don't have the jet. We don't have a jumbo jet. How are we going to do this? And so what he did is he called 206-555-1212, which is the operator in Seattle, to get the number for Boeing. And they gave him the Boeing main phone number. And he called Boeing, and he said he wanted to speak to someone who leases jumbo jets. And they'd repeatedly hang up on him. And finally, he got to some guy who would actually speak to him. And he said, look, we typically have 1 or 2 customers in each country. We know who they are. You're not one of the people we talk to in England. Goodbye. So he said, no, listen, before you hang up, do you have an old used jumbo that you'd lease to one of these customers if they came to you? He said, well, you're not one of them, but yeah, if they came to us, we actually do have an old jumbo lying around. He said, oh, well, if these people came to you, what would it cost to lease the jumbo? And so the guy mentioned, the pricing and such. He said, would you do a short-term lease? Because the jumbo was just sitting there. He said, yeah, we'd be flexible with our customers. So he convinced Boeing to lease him that jumbo because it was just sitting there. And then in the airline business, before the plane takes off, you sold all the tickets. So your revenue comes in before you've spent a dime, and then you pay for the fuel 30 days after the plane's landed. So it's a negative cash flow business in the sense that you don't need even working capital. And so he went about advertising and got the staff hired and got everything going and got this airline off the ground. And if you think about it, if someone can start a business in a tightly regulated industry like aviation with very high capex needs, like needing these jumbos with no capital, then you can pretty much say you can do that in any business, right? And if you think about the way Branson set it up, he had no downside, because what would happen if the thing didn't work? Well, he just returned the airplane, and it'd be a few $1,000s in terms of tens of thousands or whatever. And his music business at that time was producing about $3 or $4 million a year in cash flows. So they had more than enough money to kind of take care of any eventualities. And that's the nature of Dhandho, is that you're making these asymmetric bets. And one of the reasons why I think Google is such a fascinating and incredible place, because I don't think Sergey or Larry ever thought about it in these terms, but Google is the ultimate Dhandho business. And the reason it's the ultimate Dhandho business is if you look at, like, for example, your self-driving cars. So the self-driving cars, the real capex on that would come when you need to build large-scale factories to produce, millions of cars. It is not when you're doing the R&D for those cars or have a few prototypes and put a few dozen engineers on it and that sort of thing. So if you think of the outflows or outlays Google has on the self-driven car, I would bet you're probably spending more on food on the campus than you're spending on the self-driven cars. And so it's an asymmetric bet, right? It's basically, if it doesn't work, it has no impact. No impact on cash flows or anything. And if it does work, it's game-changing. Same thing with Android. A few years back, Android was a project like the self-driven car is, and it moved from being one of those, outlier, out there projects to very much central and cash flow. And then even when you look at your balloons with the internet access or all the different other projects that you guys are working on it, basically each one of those has the potential to be a game changer in terms of kind of where the world ends up. But none of those have costs associated with them that have anything to do with threatening the company in any way, right? I mean, it's a rounding error in terms of the cash flows that the company produces. So the fact that the DNA of a place like Google is able to do things which are not in adjacent fields, it's quite spectacular. And most other companies don't have the DNA to be able to do that. And my 2 cents looking from the outside is probably the only other business I see that has the ability to do that is Amazon. And I think in the end, you will meet them head to head on a number of different fronts. So that's why it's just a great place to be. And the other notion I just wanted to talk briefly about is this notion of compounding. So can we play that video? We'll just play maybe a couple of minutes of this video, and then I'll just talk about it.
आजा आजा जिंद शामी आने के तले आजा जरी वाले नीले आसमाने के तले जय हो जय हो आजा आजा जिंद शामी आने के तले आजा जरी वाले नीले आसमाने के तले जय हो मैंने जान कमाई है न चिंचित कोयलों पे रात बिताई है अखियों की नींद मैंने फूकों से उड़ा दी गिन गिन तारे मैंने उंगली जलाई है
Okay, so this notion about compounding, and you saw that slide with Einstein saying compounding is the eighth wonder of the world. There was this guy who invented the game of chess, and the king was so excited about the game and became an addicted player that he told the inventor, "You can ask for anything you want, and it'll be yours." And the inventor of the game of chess says that, I just want you to put 1 grain of rice on the first square of the chessboard, and then put 2 grains of rice on the second square, and then keep doubling the grains of rice until you get to the 64th square, and that's all I want. And that emperor clearly was not smart enough to be employed by Google, and he was mathematically challenged, so he basically got upset with this inventor. I wanted to give you all these things, and this is all you want, a bunch of rice. So the guy says, yeah, that's all I want. So he tells his treasurer, measure out the rice for him and get him out of my court. And after a week, when the treasurer was still not done, he asked him what the problem was. He said, well, it took me a while to run the calculation, but we don't have the rice. In fact, he said that there's not enough rice in the kingdom or even on the planet to fulfill the request. And the amount of rice, it becomes, 2 to the 64 minus 1, which is a long Google-ish kind of number. In today's dollars, it's about 300 trillion. And I think that is just about global GDP. Actually, not global GDP, but global wealth. So if you took the wealth of every man, woman, and child on the planet, that would have brought equal to the 2 to the 64 minus 1 grains of rice. And so that's the power of compounding, right? It grows dramatically. And when I heard about Buffett for the first time in 94, he had been compounding for about 44 years at the time, from about 1950 to 94. And when I looked at the track record, it dawned on me that he was moving basically to the next square in less than 3 years. He had averaged for the first 44 years about 31% a year. So if you compound at 26% a year, then your money doubles every 3 years. And of course, if you're doing 31%, then you're going even faster. And so basically, that is at the essence of the genius of Buffett and Munger, is they absolutely understand the power of compounding. and they basically have gone at it with this very long runway and such. And of course, if you look at it from 1950 to 2014, it is no wonder that Buffett ends up as the richest guy on the planet, because if you keep compounding, that's what ends up happening. And so that's the one of the important takeaways I took from the learnings from Buffett and Munger is that you don't really need to do extraordinary things to get extraordinary results. If you can double your money every 3 years, then a few doubles starts adding some significant numbers. I mean, if you start with $1 million in 30 years, it becomes $1 billion. If you start with 10,000, it becomes 10 million. It's just incredible in terms of what happens. And the doubling every 3 years, my way of thinking of that was that if you buy a stock at less than half of what it's worth, and you just sit on it, and in 2 or 3 years it gets to being what it's worth, lo and behold, you'll have your 20-30% annualized, and sometimes you might get it in a year, and sometimes you might have mistakes, and the blended result of all of that ends up being where it is. And so I think compounding is a very powerful notion, very much in sync with the whole Dhandho framework. And one other thing I wanted to mention is that just in the same kind of mindset of Google is that the market gets confused between risk and uncertainty, and it kind of confuses one for the other. And risk and uncertainty are two very different things. And in general, anytime you get to a situation where risk is low, but uncertainty is high, in general, the odds are high that the stock in question or business in question will be mispriced, and it'll probably be underpriced. So that combination of low risk and high uncertainty is a great combo. And the low risk means that your downside is limited. And a good way to think about that is, like, for example, when Bill Gates started Microsoft, people always think about these companies being formed as being highly risky ventures. But if you really analyze it, so when Gates started Microsoft, he did not have a net worth or assets or capital. So the fact that he was taking a high risk, well, there's no capital to lose. So you can't really have risk because of a loss of capital. And if you think about the opportunity cost, so he had not yet finished his undergraduate degree. At that time, with the couple of years that he had spent at Harvard, his value in the job market was very low. So if he went out looking for jobs and such, the people would not be willing to pay him that much. And if the venture did not work, so he moves to New Mexico, starts Microsoft. And so if you think about the notion that Microsoft doesn't work, well, he goes back to Harvard, finishes an undergraduate degree, and now when he graduates, he's got interesting stuff on his resume, that what he did in New Mexico for a year. So any way you look at it, the startup of Microsoft was almost risk-free. But the uncertainty related to Microsoft was very high. It could have been that the company failed and whatever little money he had was gone, or it could be that he could have become the wealthiest human on the planet, which he did. And so it's a very wide range of outcomes that could have happened at that point. But the key thing was that the risk was low. And in fact, if you study non-venture-backed startups like the Patels, do not take risk. In fact, we repeatedly study businesses. There's more than 1 million businesses that get started in the United States every year. Less than 1,000 of them are venture-backed, maybe a couple of thousand. So 99+% of businesses that get formed in the United States are not venture-backed businesses. And most of them follow this low-risk, high uncertainty principle when they get going, like the Patels. And so it's important to keep in mind that I think you can replace capital with creative thinking, the way Richard Branson did. And certainly for most businesses, you don't even need the capital. And certainly in a knowledge economy type business, capital actually becomes useless, if you will. So, I can keep going, but I think with that, what I'd like to do is to really hear from you and just see what you have in mind and maybe try to address questions or comments along those lines. So open up for all of you to talk.
So thank you so much, Mohnish.
Sure.
And we'll open up the floor for questions.
I've heard phrases along the lines of beware of geeks bearing spreadsheets from people like Buffett. Is there something specific that technically minded people should be aware of with investing?
I mean, I would say that, there are these, what I just talked about, these issues with uncertainty, right? So normally engineers want to see precision. And you've got to actually be open to things where you may not have all the answers. In fact, by definition, investing is a very uncertain exercise, because what you really need to do is you need to extrapolate what the future cash flows of a business are going to be, and then bring them down to the present, and then decide whether that works or not. And in many cases, in many businesses, I would say that there's probably nobody on the planet, including the founders of Google, who could tell you what Google's cash flows are going to be 5 years from now. And so, but for example, if you could put a floor on those cash flows, then that might give you a basis to invest, because you would say, okay, I know what my downside is. And floor on cash flow is a lot easier than actually predicting the cash flows, right? And so if you can, with a high probability, start putting floors on things. So I think the engineering mindset needs to change a bit. And to some extent, actually, Google's done that. If you look at your server farms, you've gone with unreliable hardware, with high failure rates and all of that, and to some extent unpredictable times and places when things can fail, but that's built into the engineering of the solution. And so you're able to accommodate a high degree of uncertainty on, so you don't know which server is going to fail when, but I think statistically you know how many will fail, and then you can kind of design around that. So I think as long as you can kind of deal with uncertainty, with generally, and the second thing is that you're probably best off never touching Excel. Right, so Excel has nothing to do with investing, so that might be heresy at Stanford Business School or something. But the way to really look at investing is that when you look at, again, a business like Google or Microsoft or Berkshire, you really have to put yourself in the shoes of the people running the business. And you have to ask yourself, how do they run the business? Do they run it through a set of spreadsheets? Or how do they run it? And I would bet that most of these businesses are run in a manner where the founders or CEOs are really looking at kind of 3 to 5 variables that dominate most of their thinking and outcome and direction. And so as an investor, you've got to hone in on those same variables. So if you can get to the same variables, if you're going to invest in Microsoft, you can get to the same variables that Satya Nadella is using, and Google, you get to the same variables that Larry and Sergey are using, then you're getting very close to trying to figure out what the business might do. And from there, you can extrapolate whether it's underpriced or fairly priced and so on. So that's what I would suggest, is avoid the use of spreadsheets and avoid precision thinking.
Can you maybe give us an example, may not be current, where you've looked at a business, looked at an industry, and said, I think if I want to analyze this business, here are the 3 variables that I think are the most important. Maybe a example from past would help too.
So a business that I didn't invest in, or?
It could be there's something you invested in, and maybe walk us through,
Sure.
Here are the 3 variables I thought were most important.
Sure. No problem. I think that's a good question. So a few years back, I think this is probably going back more than 10 years, I invested in a funeral services company. So, the gurus say, don't invest in industries with rapid change. Humans are very slow to change the way we deal with our dead. It takes, a few centuries for that to change. There's a small trend towards cremations, which you can kind of adjust for. But by and large, it's a pretty steady state situation with cremations. And so there were these two companies. They had done a major roll-up of the funeral services companies. One was Stewart Enterprises, which is based in Louisiana, and the other was Service Corp. And what they had done is they had bought a whole bunch of mom-and-pop funeral service operators, and a lot of it was bought with debt and some of it with stock. And so what ended up happening is these companies were very highly levered. And then they got so levered that they started tripping covenants on their bank debt and such. And when I looked at the companies, I think when I looked at Stewart Enterprises, it was trading at little less than $2 a share, and the cash flows that it was generating at the time were close to $1 a share. And it was fairly tight in terms of their servicing the debt and all of that, but they were still generating positive cash flow. But they had lots of assets which were not generating any cash, and they paid significant amounts for it. For example, they had bought hundreds of funeral homes in Europe, and collectively they were making no money on those, and such. So I thought that a business like that, trading at 2 times cash flows was ultra cheap, because I said, what I'll do is I'll just wait for 2 years, and then the amount we're paying for the business will just be there in cash. And what they started doing after we made the investment is they announced a sale of a large portion of the European businesses, which again was, from a cash flow point of view, has no impact, but they generated significant cash from that sale. And then they gradually were able to start to restructure some of their loans and interest rates and covenants and all of that. And in a few years, that stock was at about $8 a share. And so that's an example of, looking at something. There was another one I'd looked at. There was a steel company called IPSCO. And IPSCO had these long contracts to supply steel. And if you looked at the present cash flows and the cash flows for the next 2 years, so I think they were trading at about $90 a share. They had about $30 a share in cash, and the next 2 years of cash flows were equal to $60. And so if you just held it for 2 years, you would have the full 90 in cash, but you'd have the entire business. And it was very hard to tell after 2 years what would happen to margins and cash flows. There's high uncertainty on that front, but I really didn't care about that, because I said we'll just hold it for 2 years. And of course, we got to 2 years, they actually got the $90 in cash, and then they still had the engine running. And I think we made a 4x on that investment eventually. So there's different models and such that you can look at. But I would say the most important thing is that before you invest is you should be able to explain the thesis without a spreadsheet within 4 or 5 sentences. And typically I write down those sentences before I invest, so that if you're having a conversation with someone, you could very quickly explain, look, here's the reasons why this investment makes sense. So,
what are the top 5 attributes of a successful investor that you think are? And second unrelated question is that, does your investment style changes when you have control over company versus you don't, you're just another stakeholder, and how that changes, and how is that important for investment point of view?
Okay. Well, we'll see if we can get to 5. But, well, I would say good traits or important traits for being a good investor. Number one, the single most important skill is patience. So I think the thing is that markets have kind of a way of deceiving us, because, when you turn on CNBC and you see all those flashing red and green lights and all that, it's inducing the brain to think that you need to act now and you need to act immediately, where nothing could be further from the truth. Buffett always talks about having this punch card where in a lifetime you make 20 punches, and each time you buy a stock, you punch it once. So in a lifetime, you'd make 20 investment decisions, which means that if you started investing at 20 and ended at 80, every 3 years on average, you'd make one investment. And that is very hard for most people to do. And so the more you can slow down your investing and the more patient you can be. So the issue is that the time scales over which companies go through change and such is very different from the time scales at which stock markets operate. And so you really have to not focus so much on the stock market and have a lot more focus on the nature of change in businesses and be willing to be in there for a while. And like I told you, for the compounding to work, you don't need to double your money every 3 months. Even if you double your money every 3 years or even every 5 years, that's plenty, because it's just a matter of how many doubles you can get and such. So patience is the number one skill set. The second, I think, important skill would be that if you have run a business before, it's a huge advantage because of the whole interplay between investing and running a business, because it's very important to be able to understand how a CEO thinks and the factors that they are primarily focused on thinking about when they're running the business. And that's hard to get to with spreadsheets and so on. And I think another very important trait for successful investing is to stay within your circle of competence. So I think Buffett always says that it's not the size of the circle that matters, but knowing its boundaries. It's absolutely critical. And Charlie Munger talks about that. He gives a couple of examples. One is he says that if in a small town you bought the McDonald's franchise, you bought the Ford dealership. Ford dealership, gas station not so good. And gas station we leave to the Patels, low-cost operations. Okay, and then you want the best Class A office building, and you want the best residential building, right? So if you've got these 4 assets, and you don't need to own them completely, you could own 20% of each of them, right? So his perspective was that if in Peoria, Illinois, you own these 4 assets, and you just sat on them for your whole life, you would end up probably quite wealthy. And so if you think about it from a modern portfolio theory point of view, you would say, well, you're not diversified, everything's in one geography, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, but the odds I'd probably still work out. And in fact, he has a friend here in near Stanford, John Arriaga, who all he did was bought real estate within a mile of the Stanford campus. And, I think Arriaga is a billionaire. And so, what is Arriaga's circle of competence? It's this small. So the size of the circle is not relevant. Staying inside the circle is very fundamental. So I think circle of competence is a very important trait. Another important trait is margin of safety. So you buy things for well less than what they're worth. And then I think the final piece would be that, what Ben Graham says, that you're not buying a piece of paper, you're buying a fraction of a business. So if I were to think about investing in Google, for example, the question I should ask myself is, if my family had $1 trillion, would I be happy putting 410 billion? Is that what the market cap is right now? 410 billion? Right. So if I had $1 trillion, would I be comfortable putting 410 billion into Google? And if the answer is no, then I shouldn't put $10 into Google, right? So the mindset, so many times when people say, what do you think of Apple? And they don't know the market cap of Apple. So my question is, why are you talking to me about Apple? You don't even know what the company is for sale for, So if you're going to invest, at a minimum, you got to know what the entire business is selling for, and would you be willing to put 50, 60% of your total family assets, if you had that much, into that business? And if the answer is no, then don't go there. And I would have been willing to do that at Stewart Enterprises. At the pricing I was looking at and all that. In fact, what I would have done, I would have bought a whole bunch of the debt as well too, just to get total control over the situation. So, and then just sit on those cemeteries. That'd be fine. So, and your second question was?
If you have a control over company versus not a control over company,
right.
Should investors behave?
Yeah. So control is overrated. So people tend to think that when they have control, they can sprinkle pixie dust and things will be great. And quite frankly, I think that I don't think that's the case at all. I think that, there are businesses like Amex or Coca-Cola or Google and so on, which are such high quality businesses that, it's not so much the control issue, it's more an issue of, did you enter at the right price and those sorts of things that matter a lot more.
Buffett talk about the passion, about what you are doing, right? I think it's like Warren Buffett doesn't really care about money. He loves what he's doing, right? Okay, do you think that's what you are doing, or do you love what you are doing, and do you think that's really, really important? Another thing is that, do you think sometimes this may become an obsession? Because from reading Snowball, I have the impression that investing become an obstacle of Warren Buffett's family life, right? How do you adjust that? Yeah.
Right. I mean, I would say that my take is that Buffett is a very aligned individual in the sense that he's absolutely pursuing what he loves to do. He would be bored out of his mind if you sent him fishing forever, or sent him golfing, or just asked him to do all these other things which he has no interest in doing. So I think that he loves the game of investing. He loves more than investing. He loves actually buying entire businesses. So he's absolutely aligned on that front. And the thing is, you can I think optimize on some variables. So if you look at a person like Gandhi, Gandhi's son became a male prostitute. Okay, and in fact Gandhi neglected his kids. So there could be an entire debate we could have on whether Gandhi had done the right thing or done the wrong thing. But that, so to some extent, I think the thing is that we are human, and it may well be that a person like Gandhi could not have optimized on both fronts. You have the same issue with Nelson Mandela, right? So if you look at Nelson Mandela's personal life, there's all kinds of issues going on with the spouse and so on. And in Buffett's personal life, you've had, in fact, I always tell my wife that Warren was given a mistress by his wife. And I tell my wife that so that she's aware that that's an option. And and so far, she's not pulled the trigger on that option. But, there's still time. And so my take is that I think there are many good traits for Warren Buffett that have nothing to do with investing. I actually admire the way he even raised his kids and so on. But I think that what we are probably best off doing when we look at these, kind of iconic figures is not focus on so much the kind of minutia, because you're going to find things in the closet that will make your skin crawl. But I think look at the bigger picture and say, what can we take from there that can be useful.
So I noticed that you haven't talked about the importance of the catalyst. The catalyst for the correction of the undervaluation of financial assets such as stock. Neither does Warren Buffett or Munger talks a lot about it, but some other value investors like maybe Sykes Klarman, they insist that the catalyst is very important for a bet on the undervalued stock. For example, that I sometimes experience buying a stock at a very low valuation, such as maybe below the liquidation value and maybe just several times of the cash flow. But without the catalyst, the stock could remain undervalued and maybe go down. And I just want to know your understanding of your suggestions regarding situations like this. What do you think about the importance of the catalyst?
For the most part, you're right. I have ignored the importance of a catalyst. I think catalysts are not required. In most cases, value is its own catalyst. And I would also say that when you're buying businesses, let's say below liquidation value, for example, in my book, there's no such thing as a value trap. I think there are mistakes in investing, but not value traps. So in the end, everything is fairly valued. And so to the extent that you end up with a less than satisfactory return on an investment, it probably has less to do with whether the catalyst there or not, and more to do with just the nuances of intrinsic value of that business. So I have actually found in many cases that, in fact, the catalyst actually flies in the face of uncertainty. Because if you have a catalyst, you don't have uncertainty. And just the nature of the type of investor I am, I prefer to buy low risk, high uncertainty and let the catalyst work itself out. And it has, for the most part, I would say that, from 94, which is 5 years before I started my fund, till 2013, before fees and all that, it's been a little over 26% a year. And that engine has not needed catalyst. But there's more than one way to skin the cat. And the Seth Klarman format of investing, even though it's value investing, because value investing is a very big tent, is very different from the Buffett method of investing. One simple difference is Baupost has more than 100 investment professionals. And at Berkshire, there's one. You might say 1.5 with Charlie. But that's it, So I think there's many different ways to skin the cat. Seth's approach certainly has worked for a long time. But my personal preference and approach is to not bother with catalysts.
Hi, I have a two-part question. The first is, we had a speaker last week, Michael Moibison. He talked about untangling skill and luck in business and investing. And I thought it was very interesting. He gave the example of Bill Gates and how his mother knew someone at IBM, and that was part of the reason that he was introduced to that opportunity. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, but I think that there's a lot of other people whose mothers know all kinds of people. And I would say, yeah, I would say with Bill. So if you also look at the book Outliers, for example, it talked about the 10,000 hours and all of that. So Bill Gates, a large part of the success of Bill Gates was when he was born, right? So if Bill Gates were born 10 years before or 10 years after, it wouldn't have mattered who his mother knew. So I would say that that timing and such was definitely gave him tailwinds, very significant tailwinds. But I would also say that the Bill Gates and the Larrys and the Sergeys of the world would tend to do well, even in the face of headwinds. They would not do as well as they have done, because to do as well as they've done, everything has to line up perfectly. Right. Okay. But I would still say that you could throw Bill Gates in the fish tank with a whole bunch of other folks, and he'd come out ahead.
The second part of my question is, I recently saw a program about the Salton Sea, which was a very popular tourist area in Southern California in the 50s and 60s. And there was huge investment in that area and what seemed to be very little chance for loss. And then there was a flood in 1976, which decimated the area, and it never recovered. I'd like to get your comments on that. Because, for example, if you bought motels in that area, it would have been a total loss.
That's right. It's like I said, I think the thing with investing is there are no absolutes. So you're trying to make what I would say are high probability bets. And certainly if you are a Patel who's just left Uganda with Idi Amin breathing down your neck, and all you can do is buy one motel, then, and that's the nature of most business owners, is in certain times of their career, they will have extreme concentration risk. And it's pretty normal. I mean, we have so many bankruptcies that happen in the US all the time. And many of those are not their fault. They just happen to be just in the, just dead center of a tornado. And so you get hit. So it's just the nature of the beast. So the good news you have as a passive investor is you can spread it out a bit. So I would say don't buy 40 stocks, but you could buy 4 or 3, and even if you bought 3 stocks after researching them properly, the biggest asset you have is yourself and your ability to work at Google and produce cash flows and so on. So you have another kind of, I would say, ace in the hole if you have that sort of situation. So I think in your particular circumstance, you don't need to go all in one place.
You talked about the value investing tent. And you also talked about 20 punches. And if my understanding is correct, then the 20 punches naturally causes Warren Buffett style of investing to look for compounding machines, because you have limited time, in your lifetime when you're going to identify compounding machines. And in those times, he has been willing to pay what traditionally may not sound like value. For example, he paid like 28 times earnings on Moody's, and he paid 25 times on Coke. And there's obviously the other extreme of like Ben Graham. Where exactly do you fall in, and have you felt the urge or the need to say over your past career that I need to change my tent and move slightly here, slightly there? What has been some of the thoughts?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. The best possible business you could invest in is a great business that's growing at a nice clip and that has high returns on capital, and one that can absorb the capital it produces. That would be the kind of the gold standard. And probably Google gets the closest to that. I would say even a business like Coke or Amex, the problem is they're very good businesses. Yeah, they're not able to consume the cash they put forth. So those types of businesses, which are compounding machines, which are able to absorb capital, tend to be few and far between and tend to be ridiculously overpriced typically, or at least on perception basis they're overpriced. So if you can't find that, then you go to plan B. And Buffett has done, even now he continues to do plenty of plan B type investing. So for example, he bought the debt of a specialty finance company called Finova, which was basically just mispriced, and they were just looking for that whole thing to be in runoff, and they would make a return on it. But it's nothing like Coke or Amex. And so I would say first plan, compounding machines. You can't get that, then you go to plan B, which is undervalued assets and so on. I have learned, probably the hard way, that it's better to put as much as you can on the great businesses with great managers, even if you pay up a little bit. But old habits die hard. We still like to have that hunt for the extremely cheap business as well. And so it's a mix. I would say that it's a mix, and it just depends on. I'm flexible. I think it's very important in investing to be a learning machine and to have flexibility and to be willing to look at the opportunity set and decide whether you need to do anything at all, or what is the best thing you can do based on the available opportunities, and then take it from there. So sometimes it can just be one of these mispriced bets that plays out in 2 or 3 years, and maybe that can go into a compounding machine and so on. So flexibility is a good trait, but it's always good to get into those compounding machines. I think those are the holy grail. So with that, let's all thank Mohnish very much for the talk.